Hello. So in this video, I'm going to talk you through a lesson plan for teaching your students to tailor their resumes to a particular job call. Now, I teach this for a business writing class, a professional writing class, but any course in which you're teaching resumes, this is a good lesson to incorporate. So the idea here is that you're separating the generic resume, the sort of general resume, the kind of thing that you could hand out to a number of different jobs or that you might put up on LinkedIn or something like this, from a targeted resume. A resume that is specifically intended for a particular job call. So I start by talking to my, preliminarily, I'll say, when I teach this for a 75-minute class, I also talk about personal branding on this day, because personal branding is definitely connected to the idea of targeting job materials in general. So the first portion of my lesson is about targeting a resume specifically, tailoring a resume specifically. And if you're teaching a 50-minute class or something like this, that probably will take up your whole time. If you have a 75-minute class, you can add the personal branding lesson on. Otherwise, you could do that on a different day. So I start by telling my students some of the key things to be thinking about when starting to consider how to tailor your application materials. So when you're looking critically and carefully at a job ad, you want to be thinking about keywords in that job ad, particularly verbs and the list of responsibilities, because these are the things that the job requires a candidate be able to do. And it's also worth noting that increasingly nowadays, companies are using automated scanners or AI programs to look through resumes to determine who is and isn't a qualified candidate. So the more of their keywords you can incorporate into your materials, the more likely you are that that program, that scanner, will flag your resume as someone they would want to hire. So that's worth keeping in mind. So that's the first thing that I tell my students to be thinking about is keywords, especially verbs and responsibilities. The second key thing to be thinking about is the organization of material within the resume itself. So that means not just the order that things are put in, and there are generic resume guidelines that determine some of the things to keep in mind, like employers are most interested in employment experience and education, so those should be your first two sections after contact information, even if there's other things like leadership experience or something like that might make you a better fit for this job. Those are still just across the board the two sections that employers are most concerned about. But within particular sections, something like a skills section, the order in which you list your skills, that can be something that works in your favor. The order in which you put your bullet points describing what you did in a previous job or a current job or something like this. This is a way of creating emphasis. And so that's the other component of this, organization and emphasis. Again, within each section, there's a generic resume requirement that you should be listing things in reverse chronological order, starting from your most current to earliest experiences. But you can draw emphasis to earlier experiences if they're more relevant by putting more description of them. So maybe let's say you have a very recent job that's not that relevant. If it's completely irrelevant, you can just leave it off your resume, unless it's a current job. Your current job should be listed. But let's say you just got out of a job last year, and it's irrelevant to the work that you're applying for. You can take it off. That's fine. What you may want to do, though, especially with very recent jobs, is de-emphasize them by just taking out bullet points that describe what you did in those activities or in those jobs. So this is a way of de-emphasizing by taking out description or increasing the emphasis by adding more description. So that's something worth keeping in mind as a tailoring strategy for resumes. So we talk about that, those sort of general principles. Then I will have saved a particular job call. You can find any job call on Indeed or Monster or wherever it is. I happened to choose one that's basically a sort of camp counselor type job, but you can choose anyone that appeals to you, anyone that's relevant to the types of work your students are going to be applying for. And I have my students look at that job call. And the first portion of this activity involves identifying keywords, key phrases, the things that they are looking for. So again, this is exactly the same thing I would want my students to do, to read these job ads critically and carefully. So we look through it, and I let them work by themselves with a partner or in a small group, whatever they prefer, to identify the things that this job is primarily interested in. Then we talk about those as a group, and I put up on the projector the PDF, and I'll highlight things on the PDF. You can do this however makes sense to you. For me, that makes a lot of sense. I'll highlight the key things that they identify on the PDF so that stuff is marked. And we talk about how we know which things are more important and which things aren't. So we talk about, for instance, how repetition of key words or key ideas indicates their importance, how stuff that comes earlier in the job ad tends to be more significant, etc., etc. Then I give them a sample resume that I've created. It's a generic sort of student-y type resume in the particular field of this job, but not specifically tailored to that job ad. So it's a resume where most of the stuff is relevant. Some of the stuff could be taken out, but for the most part, this is a resume of somebody who has done a pretty good job preparing themselves to work in this field. And I asked the students to, once again, working by themselves with a partner, small group, tailor that resume for this specific job. So incorporate keywords, key ideas, incorporate the language from the job call, think about if there's organization stuff that needs to be moved around, etc., etc. I give them a decent amount of time to work on this. Then we come back together as a group, and I'll put up, and I encourage them to turn on track changes as they're making these revisions so that they can remember what changes they've made. And I'll put on track changes on the version that I put up on the projector on Microsoft Word. And then I'll ask students to tell me what changes they made, and I'll make those changes on the document itself. And then when we get through whatever changes people want to volunteer, we talk about them. We talk about the changes that were good, things like incorporating language directly from the job ad to describe the experience on the resume, things like that. And if necessary, we talk about changes that are maybe not as fantastic. Like this year, this semester, spring 2022, in 2 of my sections, students wanted to move the leadership experience section ahead of employment and education. So we talked about why you don't want to do that, even if leadership experience is more relevant to the job than those other 2 sections. So we talk about those changes. Then I show my students a tailored version of the resume that I created, and I highlighted my changes from the untailored resume in green so that attention, to draw attention to the changes that I had particularly made. And I talk about the reasons that I made the changes that I made, which are mostly at the level of language choices. So that's the portion. If you were teaching, again, a 50-minute class, that's the portion of this lesson plan I would do in that day. It's focused on the resume itself. For the 75-minute class, I then turn our attention to personal branding. And I start by talking a little bit about personal branding, about just sort of defining it as the set of impressions you want people in the professional sphere to have of you, the things you want people to associate with you, etc., etc. And they'll have done a little bit of homework reading on this, watched some videos, etc., etc. So they'll start to have this sense anyway. But then I talk about some of the things that you want to consider when starting to build your personal brand. So one is the sort of overarchingness of the personal brand. So your social media should reflect your personal brand. A personal website, if you have one, your LinkedIn profile, in addition to things like your resume and job application materials. And then we talk about some of the things you want to start considering when figuring out your personal brand. And I show my students this chart, which happens to be in the particular textbook that I'm teaching out of. And essentially, this has 4 key questions that you can use to start determining your personal brand. So I talk through those 4 key questions. So that's, who am I? What qualifications, experience, background, knowledge, etc. do I have? Why am I here? What are my professional ambitions? What do I want to achieve? What am I motivated by? What can I offer? So what skills, attributes, abilities do I have that would be beneficial to a potential employer, a potential client, even a potential coworker? And what would I learn to love more, or what would I love to learn more about? Sorry. So what am I interested in and dedicated to improving about myself? So these are good questions to start brainstorming stuff to build your personal brand. And so I give students maybe 7 to 10 minutes to start brainstorming. I tell them they can either answer these questions or they can think more holistically about their personal brand, about what they would want people to associate them with. So I give them some time to start brainstorming that. Then I ask 2 people to volunteer to share what they've brainstormed. People may be reluctant to do this because a personal brand is very personal and they haven't had very much time to start developing this. Sometimes you'll get good personal brand information, especially if students have started thinking about this before. Sometimes you will get like a list of answers to these questions, and that's fine as well. When I get that, here's a list of answers to these questions, what I tend to do is say, okay, so you've got a good amount of stuff here, and that stuff is great. That's a great foundation to build on. What you now want to do is establish the kernel of that stuff. So what's the core element? What's the key thing that pulls all of that stuff together and makes you distinct as a potential employee, a potential client, a potential worker, a potential colleague, whatever it is? What makes your brand a brand as such? I next briefly talk to them about the idea of an elevator pitch, the very short, like 30-second maximum condensed version of your personal brand information. I think this is a really good thing to be thinking about, even if you're in the process of developing your personal brand, because having that very, very short version forces you to think carefully about what's essential in your brand. And as with all elevator pitches, because they're very short, they're designed not to lose a reader or a listener's attention. So that's a good skill set to have as well. Then I end my lesson, we have a discussion forum post. If you have a course management system where you can have students answer questions in a public discussion type scenario, that works really well. Basically, I have them start to explain their personal brand. So what values, skills, attributes, abilities, etc. do they want people to associate them with? Sometimes students will have done the brainstorming about their personal brand in that discussion forum, so they'll already have some of that material generated. But then I also ask them to brainstorm 3 ways that their targeted application materials, so the resume and a job application letter, could reflect their personal brand. So start thinking about how you incorporate this into your job materials and how you express this personal brand through those materials. How do you convey this to an employer?